write down argument map of John Stuart Mill's On the Liberty of Thought and Discussion. Now, to be clear, so we're starting, this is how I have refined John Stuart Mill's argument. This isn't necessarily the only way that the argument can be refined, but I've chosen to refine it this way, and I think that this really represents, to the best I can capture it, what I really think Mill is trying to argue and how his argument functions. So we begin with Mill's primary thesis. Okay, Chapter 2 of his larger work on liberty is On the Liberty of Thought and Discussion. And the argument therein is that all censorship is bad policy. This is his initial claim. Now, I've worded it in a very simple kind of way. His wording of it was much more complex, and, it's all about how government, blah, 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 and no government that doesn't have interests identical with the people. But he's talking about censorship, and he's opposed to it, right? There's the two things that we need to know. Censorship, copular verb, is bad policy. And now we're good to go, right? We know this is his argument. Now, the argument that he uses to support this claim is a very simple logical syllogism. Okay, it looks like this. He starts with the idea that all policies that cause harm are bad policies. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with John Stuart Mill, he's a utilitarian. He outlines his theory of what's good in the first chapter, the introduction to On Liberty. He says we're talking about utility, or the consequences of an action, right? This is how we judge it, not by some vague abstract idea of rights or principles, but by the consequences of our action, right? Then, I want to say page 11 or 12, right, of his essay, right, the first couple of pages of the On Liberty of Thought and Discussion, that's where Mill introduces this idea of, right, he's talking about the reason that he's opposed to the censoring of ideas is because it's harmful. He says it's harmful to us as individuals, it's harmful to us as society, it's harmful to the present, it's harmful to the future, it's harmful socially, it's harmful politically, right, like he covers every base. He says it's harmful in every conceivable way. So that's where we get our minor premise here, right, that all censorship is a policy that causes harm. This leads us to the conclusion. Anytime you see those three dots, right, that means conclusion, that all censorship is bad policy, right? Okay, we have a nice, clear, logical syllogism. But, okay, this minor premise, the mediating premise here, this is the thing that he has not attempted to prove. And in fact, the whole essay is about proving that, in fact, all form of censorship causes harm. The first half of the essay, all right, up through about page 22, he's talking about, right, how censorship of true beliefs, right, is bad, right? Okay, and to go back a second here, right, look, we got two new syllogisms. First, he's got to prove that it's wrong or it's bad or it's harmful to censor true beliefs, okay? That's what you're seeing on the screen right here, right? Okay, that accessing true beliefs or censoring true beliefs causes harm. He does that first by saying that, if you censor things, right, okay, then all practices that deny access to true beliefs cause harm. And this is one of his core assumptions, right? This is an enthymematic assumption that Mill makes, which is that if you are denying access to true beliefs, that is a harm. That is a fundamental bedrock assumption of Mill's arguments, right? So, the argument that he's got to make here then is that if we engage in censorship, inevitably we're going to deny access to true beliefs, right? No matter how hard we try, no matter how much constraints or efforts or safeguards we put on it, once you start censoring, you're going to cut people off from true beliefs, and that's bad, right? Why? Because if we don't have access to true belief, that's a harm, and then you see, right, how censorship of true beliefs is a practice which causes harm, and that goes up here and helps support this argument, right? This mediating premise, which he needs in order to make this syllogism work. But he's also got to prove that the censorship of false beliefs is a practice which denies aspect to false beliefs, and that denying us access to false beliefs causes harm, right? Okay, because if he only proves that our concern is true beliefs, okay, if it's just cutting us off from true beliefs, okay, yeah, but that's only part of what's out there in censorship. There's also false beliefs. He's got to prove both true and false, otherwise he doesn't prove all, and that's what's really crucial here. Okay, so how does he go about proving this? Well, he's got to prove that the censorship of true beliefs denies us access to it. And he does that through a rather kind of complicated argument here. Now, these brackets okay, are there to show you that even though we have two claims here, right, and they're both hypothetical statements, right, antecedent if, consequent then, they're both hypothetical statements, but this is a premise on a conditional two-part hypothetical premise, right? If all sensors are fallible, then they'll err. And if they err, then they will necessarily err between the true and the false, right? That means that they're going to censor something that is actually true sooner or later, okay? Both of those conditional statements are established. We then establish, right, okay, the antecedent condition of the first one, that all sensors are in fact fallible. If that's true, consequent, then they'll err between the true and the false. And if they err between the true and the false, consequent of that is that they will sometimes censor that which is true. And if they sometimes censor that which is true, follow this arrow, then censorship of true beliefs, censorship will deny access to those beliefs. Even if we don't want it to, any effort to censor will inevitably result in our being denied access to true beliefs. That is a prima facie harm, and ergo censorship is harmful. Now, Mill does go through an effort here because there is a potential weakness in the argument, right? And that is here on whether or not all sensors are indeed fallible, right? So Mill needs another argument. He's got to be able to demonstrate, no, even if they're the monarch, even if they're the majority, even if they've been sworn in as a representative of the state, even if they're a priest, if they're a human being, they're fallible and they make errors. And he sets up a very simple argument, right? All persons are fallible, all sensors are persons, therefore all sensors are fallible, right? Okay, that connects to this point. It makes sure that our mediating premise works, and there our whole argument now flows in support of that point. And therein, Mill supports his first argument. Now, for those of you who want to make sure you're getting things right in life, important to remember that this, as we follow from all censorship is bad policy, and we follow these arrows back, okay, this is all what we call subordinate compound argumentation, right? Okay, this point here, that all censors are fallible people, is subordinate to this argument, that censorship necessarily will result in the suppression of truth, which is subordinate to this argument, which is that censorship will deny access to true beliefs, which supports the idea that censorship is a bad policy. Subordinate compound argument. But if Mill only proves that censorship that denies access to true beliefs causes harm, okay, if he does that, then he hasn't proven that all censorship is bad policy. He's only proven that some censorship is a bad policy. So Mill also has to prove that even if we know something is false, it's wrong to censor or deny access to that information too. This is a really fun, complicated argument. I like this one a lot, right? And it starts here, right? It begins with a disjunctive syllogism, right? That beliefs are either based on knowledge or they're based on authority, right? And then he says, if there is censorship, then beliefs are not based on knowledge. And that leads us to the conclusion that if there's censorship, then beliefs are based on authority, right? What he's done is he's set up two premises. The first premise is a disjunct, and the second premise is a hypothetical, right? To where he says, listen, it's one or the other, it's got to be one, and it can't be both. And if it's censorship, then it's not that one, right? So if you have censorship, then your knowledge, the information, the beliefs that you have is not actually knowledge, it's simply received knowledge from authority, okay? That's a syllogism. Let's unpack this a little bit more, okay? How does he get here? Well, Mill starts again. This is one of his core fundamental assumptions. The way Mill defines knowledge is that knowledge, in order to be called knowledge at all, has to be based on a rational choice between alternatives, right? Okay, so if I offer you pie and nothing else, and you take pie, then that's not knowledge, right? If I offer you pie and cake, and you get to choose between them based on their relative merits, based on their opportunities, based on your own prejudices, then you've made a rational choice. And that, when it comes to ideas and concepts and beliefs and thoughts, that's how we get knowledge. If I tell it to you and you go, okay, and accept it, in Mill's definition, that's not really knowledge. That's stuff that comes from authority, right? So, here's our argument, because he needs to support this claim, right? Okay, he needs to support the claim that if there is censorship, then beliefs aren't based on knowledge, they're only based on authority. So he takes this definition of knowledge, and from this, he's able to generate, again, a two-part, two-hypothetical premise kind of initial claim here, right? That says where there is no complete access to alternatives, then there is no capacity to make rational choices. And if there's no capacity to make rational choices, there is no knowledge, right? He sets up this chain of reasoning based upon or inferred from the definition of knowledge that he gives us. So we then have our mediating premise. Censorship is a practice which precludes complete access to alternatives, right? Okay, therefore, if there is censorship, then we don't have full access to the alternatives. That then triggers that chain of antecedents and consequences. Okay, antecedent, there's not complete access to alternatives. Therefore, conclusion, there's no capacity to make rational choices. Therefore, conclusion, there is no knowledge. Ergo, if there is censorship, then beliefs cannot be based on knowledge. And if they're not based on knowledge, then our disjunct must be true that they're based on authority. The reason this is crucial, and notice that whole argument chain that we just went through is right here now, right? Okay, it's right here, okay, because we've now added another long chain of reasoning up here that is even more complicated. And this form of reasoning that begins with a kind of disjunctive and it goes through, what we're really establishing is that Mill is kind of putting us into a dilemma. It's this or that, and if it's that, it's bad, right? So he sets up first, if a belief is based on authority, then it has no ability to defend itself because you don't know the underlying arguments that make defending it possible, right? Because that comes from knowledge. So he establishes that premise. And he says, listen, if a true belief, even if it's true, but it's not really knowledge because you don't have the arguments, is unable to defend itself from criticism, then it's going to be displaced by falsehood. And if its falsehood displaces truth, okay, then access to truth is denied. We've already established then, through this chain of subordinate reasoning, right, this is a subordinate compound argument, we follow it all the way through to here, then we've established that if there's no censorship, then it's based on authority. And if it's based on authority, then the truth can't defend itself from criticism. And if it's unable to protect itself from criticism, then it's going to be displaced by falsehood. And then access to true beliefs is denied, right? Which feeds us then right back, okay, all the way up here, which says that any policy that denies access to false beliefs, all right, also necessarily inhibits our ability to access true beliefs. And we've already come to the conclusion that a policy that denies access to true beliefs is a policy which causes harm. And therefore, denial of access to false beliefs is a policy that causes harm. And look, there's how we go. And again, we take this line of reasoning and we follow it all the way through, right to this point here, our original two arguments, and up it goes to all censorship is bad policy. And there's the two distinctive lines of reasoning. Now, from our thesis statement all the way down here, we already established, right, that this is a subordinate chain of reasoning. This, if we follow this arrow all the way down and all the way back, is also a subordinate chain of reasoning. But this chain and this chain, because they don't intersect with one another, because this chain of reasoning and that chain of reasoning don't overlap in any way, then they are what we call compound coordinate arguments. I need them both, right? They're coordinate because I need both of them in order to support my all. If I only have one, I get some, and I haven't proven my thesis, right? So I need both of them, but they don't function together. In the way that they intersect, they function each other in the way that they support the same thing together. They're like equal parallel lines of argument that work together to support a thesis. That's what makes them coordinate rather than subordinate lines of reasoning. So that's my breakdown. That's how I refined his argument, and I hope you found it really super awesome and valuable.